Welcome to Europe and Globe, the podcast that explores today's world and changes the way we look at tomorrow's challenges. I can see you drinking a nice cup of coffee, an expresso, a double espresso, a macchiato, a café latte, or a cappuccino. Today, we're going to discover together whether the contents of this good cup with its captivating aromas have an impact on deforestation.
As you've probably understood, today's topic is coffee. Specifically, if your morning cup might be linked to deforestation in Africa.
Hello, I'm Elodie Ritzenthaler.
Hello, I'm Aysata Tiam-Leonov.
And this is a Europe and Globe podcast. The EU deforestation-free regulation, also called EUDR, was adopted in 2023. It becomes mandatory on January 1st, 2026. And it obliges companies that place coffee on the EU market to comply with the laws of producing countries on human rights and social and environmental issues. These operators must also provide the GPS coordinates of the plots of origin of the products. All this information will be compiled in a due diligence document, which can be verified by the authorities of the EU member states. In this way, the authorities will be able to check our imports at the port of Antwerpen, Piraeus, or Gothenburg and check that the plots of land on which the coffee is grown have not been deforested since the 31st of December, 2020.
Let's start with the basics. Where did coffee originally come from? It is said that coffee is originally from Ethiopia in the Kaffa region, and that production spread first to Yemen, then to Asia, Latin America, and other African countries.
Yes, that's right.
There are several varieties of coffee, but the main distinction is made between Arabica and Robusta. What are the differences between the two?
Robusta grows mainly in lowland areas, in Vietnam and Uganda. Robusta has a fuller flavor and aroma and contains more caffeine. Arabica grows at higher altitudes, between 800 and 1,000 meters, and it has finer, sweeter flavors. In Africa, Arabica is mainly produced in Ethiopia, Burundi, Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, and the DRC. Uganda and Côte d'Ivoire mainly produce Robusta.
Coffee is produced in more than 50 countries in the world, but half of the world's production is made by Brazil and Vietnam. In fact, 5 countries alone account for 73% of total production.
Yes, after Brazil and Vietnam come Colombia, Indonesia, and Ethiopia. Latin America accounts for 55% of world coffee production, and Asia for 34%. Africa counts for 11%. In the 2 largest producing countries, Brazil and Vietnam, coffee plantations are very large. And monoculture has been widely promoted. This means hectares and hectares of land covered with coffee trees only. This is a profitable and efficient technique for producing coffee, but it requires agricultural inputs and irrigation systems to maintain a consistent yield. In Africa, the coffee sector directly and indirectly supports the livelihoods of around 40 million people throughout the value chain. They generally have between 0.5 and 2.5 hectares of land, and the number of commercial plantations, unlike in Brazil or Vietnam, is limited.
The challenges associated with coffee can be very high in African countries because the number of smallholder farmers is huge.
Yes, that's right. In Ethiopia, there are 5 million smallholder farmers involved in the coffee sector. In Uganda, we have 1.8 million small producers, 700,000 to 800,000 in Kenya and Burundi, and more than 350,000 in Tanzania and Rwanda.
In most African coffee-producing countries, farmers also grow various food crops on their land alongside coffee.
Yes, these crops are very important for the livelihoods of small producers and are often intercropped with coffee. We find beans or taro, or even in Ethiopia, we also find cat.
A little clarification for our listeners. Taro is a tuber, much like a sweet potato, and cat is a plant whose leaves are chewed up for their stimulating effect. Cat is found in Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Yemen primarily.
That's true. Let's get back to coffee. Most African coffee is produced under forest cover, together with banana trees, avocado, or eucalyptus trees, for example.
Let's remember that integrating other trees and crops creates a microclimate that increases the biodiversity, enriches soils, reduces erosion and water pollution, and improves carbon storage.
It also brings social benefits through increased productivity. We can certainly find large coffee plantations on the African continent, as in Brazil or Vietnam, but not as much. Generally in Africa, where there are coffee trees, we can also find other trees.
That's interesting. The two main coffee-producing countries in Africa are Ethiopia and Uganda.
Together, they represent 3/4 of the continent's production. Other African players include Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, Cameroon, Côte d'Ivoire, Sierra Leone, and a few others. All these countries are coffee producers, but on a smaller scale. And coffee production is quite concentrated in East and Central African countries.
Surprisingly, African coffee-producing countries often do not consume it.
Yes, with the exception of Ethiopia, where the majority of the national production is consumed by Ethiopians. Otherwise, most all the African production is exported.
Apparently, EU citizens are the world's top coffee drinkers.
Yes, we buy 24% of the world's coffee production, but we mostly buy from Brazil or Vietnam. Only 13% of the coffee we consume in Europe comes from the African continent.
European coffee purchases are essential for many African countries and can represent a major economic issue, both for local incomes and for national budgets.
Absolutely, because we buy 35% of the coffee exported by Ethiopia, Burundi, or Kenya, 45% of Tanzanian coffee, and 61% of the coffee produced by Uganda.
So, does coffee contribute to deforestation on the African continent?
As we said, most coffee is produced under forest cover, and therefore, a priori, coffee contributes very little to deforestation on the African continent.
Yes, but there are some exceptions, such as in Burundi, right?
In Burundi, there are no huge plantations and monoculture, and coffee is produced with other crops and trees. But many forest-hosting coffee production areas are already degraded. We have to understand that the country has faced a conflict that lasted for many years, and also population densities are high.
And in Côte d'Ivoire, today's coffee production is only about a third of what it was back in the 70s.
Yes, we have analyzed the Ivorian situation when we talked about cocoa in the previous episode. We have shown that the country has experienced massive losses of forest cover, more than 50% over the past 25 years, soil degradation and climate change, all of which have a significant impact on the agricultural production of Côte d'Ivoire and on the volumes harvested.
Let's talk about the EU deforestation-free regulation, the EUDR, in the coffee sector. We have seen that the level of preparedness for the implementation of the EUDR varies from one country to another. So what is the role of the governments? Is the sector liberalized? How is it structured? What is the situation?
The situation seems more difficult in Ethiopia, where, as we said, there are 5 million of small producers, but also because of an auction system at the national level. There are a large number of intermediaries and a state that is quite present in the sector. If we talk about Burundi, it is a small country in which the Office for the Development of Coffee of Burundi, ODECA, is trying to regulate the sector and plays a key role as an intermediary between small producers and international buyers. But its resources are limited, and the sector is not highly structured. As for Tanzania, it also has an auction system, and smallholder farmers are not highly organized into cooperatives. All these elements obviously have some consequences on the competitiveness of the sector, but they can also be an obstacle for the introduction of good social and environmental practices.
In countries like Uganda and Kenya, it seems easier to comply with the EU deforestation-free regulation requirements.
First of all, because the public-private dialogue is well structured there. And then in Uganda, 10 companies buy 75% of the country's coffee exports. and they decide to work together to harmonize their data and to collect them. As for Côte d'Ivoire and Kenya, they have set up national traceability systems. That is to say, public systems, which make it possible to register production plots and farmers.
However, it seems that until recently, some coffee exporting companies did not always know where and how their coffee was harvested and processed.
It's true, especially in countries where there is a public auction system. The small farmers are used to selling at the farm gate every day. 3 kilograms of coffee cherries harvested today, 10 kilograms tomorrow. The buyer comes to the farm on a motorcycle. Today, this is Daniel, and tomorrow it will be Elias who buys the harvest. And then Daniel or Elias or a third guy reaches another guy who has a lorry, who takes the day's harvest to the cooperative or the washing center, and then it all goes to the warehouses where it can stay several weeks before the auction. There are many productions that can be mixed and are coming from many different fields and places. And that's what the situation was like in Ethiopia, so it's understandable that traceability is more complicated. But in other countries, operators and corporations, at least the bigger ones and social businesses, already had their own agents and warehouses. This enabled them to have more direct contact with farmers and fewer intermediaries. It makes it easier now for them to trace the coffee and to collect the GPS coordinates of the plots.
And then there are also some certifications, right?
Yes, certification allows players in the coffee sector to provide high-quality and traceable products for their customers. In 2022, certified coffee already represented around 30% of global purchases, but in the main African coffee-producing countries, these certifications only represent around 10 to 15% of their production.
And only Arabica is certified.
Absolutely, and some countries are highly involved in developing these approaches. For example, the largest cooperative in the world, called the Oromia Coffee Farmers Cooperative Union in Ethiopia, brings together more than 40 cooperatives and more than 560,000 farmers.
That's huge.
Yes, and it has launched organic and fair trade certifications to obtain better sales prices.
It is important for our listeners to know that the primary certification systems for coffee are essentially the same as those for cocoa. Think Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance, Organic Coffee, and a few others.
Yes, these are private certifications. It means that they are defined by private companies in the sector with, in addition, a few NGOs around the table. And together, they define the social and environmental indicators they want to comply with in order to be certified. But until recently, these certifications, while they help to encourage more sustainable practices, did not cover all the social and environmental indicators included in the EU deforestation-free regulation, and the market for certified coffee is relatively low.
According to the latest Coffee Barometer, which is an annual publication carried out by a group of NGOs, 74% of certified coffee in 2021 was actually marketed as conventional coffee. This clearly shows that sustainable coffee remains a niche market.
True, and this means that some smallholder farmers and cooperatives who are certified, who have made some investments to comply with good agricultural, social, and environmental practices, have never received any benefits from their efforts, such as premium prices. This situation is a clear obstacle to certification, and it undermines their motivation to invest in best practices.
However, certified producers are more advanced in EU deforestation-free regulation compliance, since they already follow good social and environmental practices, and they know how to meet specific indicators and reporting obligations.
Yes, and in addition, private certification organizations such as Fairtrade and Rainforest Alliance have revised their indicators to align them with the obligations of the European deforestation-free regulation, and they provide the necessary tools for coffee traceability.
Also, the biggest coffee operators didn't wait for the EU deforestation-free regulation to develop sustainability systems and traceability tools.
Indeed, the largest companies were already well advanced in 2024 in terms of social and environmental reporting and on the implementation of good practices. Generally speaking, as with cocoa, the coffee sector is very asymmetrical. And while there are millions of smallholder farmers, often 10 large companies buy the 2/3 of national productions, and the vast majority of exported coffee volumes, as we have seen for Uganda.
But with or without the EU deforestation-free regulation, the coffee sector is still facing many challenges.
One of the challenges is first in the deployment of good agricultural practices to increase the productivity per hectare rather than increasing the production areas. But with climate change, coffee production tends to decline, particularly Arabica, which is more fragile and which is planted at increasingly higher altitudes. Robusta, as its name suggests, is more resistant to pests and climatic hazards.
On social issues, in African coffee-producing countries, child labor remains widespread, and many children still do not go to school.
Yes, in rural Ethiopia, over 90% of children aged between 6 and 15 have never been to school, which is absolutely staggering. In Uganda, almost 1 child in 5 does not attend school. And in Burundi, 37% of children under 15 have no level of education.
And what about land conflicts? What is the situation?
Well, there are some difficulties in many countries. In Uganda and Burundi in particular, because population densities are very high and are expected to increase rapidly in the years to come due to demographic pressure. It may lead to increased conflicts related to land use and to a fall in coffee production.
Another topic. In the DRC and probably also in Burundi, it is estimated that about 40% of the national production gets smuggled across borders, either for local consumption or exported by neighboring countries.
Yes, a large part of the coffee from the DRC and Burundi is smuggled into Rwanda or even Uganda and is sold as a product originating from these countries. The EU deforestation-free regulation should therefore have some consequences on smuggling and the controls that operators will have to carry out on their chain of custody. In addition, the EUDR will also require the coffee sector to be better structured since traceable and non-traceable coffee will have to be separated. And if there is non-traceable coffee mixed with the rest, then the whole batch is condemned to not being able to be exported to the European Union.
So will smallholder coffee producers in Africa be affected by the EU deforestation-free regulation?
We believe that African operators and coffee-producing countries should retain their share of the EU market. Firstly, because African coffee is naturally bought by European countries, just as coffee from Vietnam and Indonesia is consumed mainly in Asia, or that Brazilian, Colombian, or Peruvian coffees are mainly bought by North America. And secondly, African countries should keep their share of the European market because their coffee varieties, flavors, and specific aromas are appreciated.
And we can add that in the coffee sector, apart from the big corporations, there are also many social businesses who work closely with smallholder farmers.
Absolutely, and they develop sustainable social and environmental practices and traceability.
But in 2024, many African countries had expressed their concerns about not being able to meet the EU deforestation-free regulations requirements.
But the one-year deadline granted at the end of 2024 for its implementation on the 1st of January 2026 is seen as an appropriate EU decision. And it has been welcomed by various governments, in Ethiopia, Uganda, and Kenya, for example. However, some problems could still remain for countries such as Burundi or the DRC, and for small national operators who work with many intermediaries, middlemen, etc. But overall, it is going in the right direction.
So, will the EU deforestation-free regulation have a real impact on deforestation in Africa and in the coffee sector? And will it affect the price of a cup of coffee in Brussels, Paris, Rome, or Amsterdam?
Well, on the EUDR impact, the EU is not the only buyer of African coffee, but it remains a key player. And we have seen that many operators and governments have invested a lot to ensure that they meet European obligations on deforestation and sustainability. So that is rather encouraging and positive. Also, as we have said it already, most African coffee is grown under forest cover. At the moment, world coffee prices are high because the volumes of coffee harvested in Vietnam and in Brazil have been very low. In these two main coffee world producers, climate change has disrupted the harvest. Because of this situation, probably the EU deforestation-free regulation itself might not have a huge impact on the coffee price the final consumers will pay in the coming months. In addition, to prevent the risks of not being compliant, many companies have done huge stocks in their warehouses in Europe since 2024. And many invested even before the EU deforestation-free regulation on sustainable practices and on traceability. So, given the way companies and governments have mobilized and considering that there are still a few months to catch up, we can be optimistic.
Okay, then overall, the outlook for African coffee is fairly positive. That's all for the African coffee sector. Thank you, Elodie.
Thank you, Aisata.
In the next episode, we will shift our focus to the palm oil sector.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.